In 1987, a Harvard psychologist gave a room of strangers a single instruction. For 5 minutes, do not think about a white bear. Ring a bell every time it crossed their mind. Within the first 60 seconds, the room could not stop ringing that bell. That bell is still ringing in you. Every time you order yourself to stop obsessing over the mistake, stop replaying what he said, stop feeling the anxiety that has no business showing up right now, you are rerunning the exact experiment that collapsed in that room a century after it was first understood. The instruction was never the problem you assumed it was. The instruction itself was the mechanism that guaranteed the failure, and you have been issuing it to yourself for years without ever learning its name. Carl Jung had already described this law decades before anyone rang a bell in a lab. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he called it enantiodromia, a running contrariwise, the principle that whatever is driven to an extreme eventually converts into its opposite. Suppress a thought with enough force, and it does not disappear. It waits, gathers what you fed it, and comes back, holding the wheel. This is not a metaphor for your Tuesday nights, your 2 a.m. spirals, or the argument you keep having in the shower. It is the exact mechanics of a war you have been losing for years, without ever realizing you were the one who declared it. What this video shows you is not how to win that war. It is the exact mechanism Jung mapped for ending it, a shift he called the transcendent function, and precisely how to trigger it the next time a thought comes for you. So the real question was never how to finally win that war. It is what happens the day you stop showing up to fight it at all. Enantiodromia. That's the word for what happened in that room with the white bear, and it's the word for what happens every single time you tell yourself to stop feeling something. Jung didn't invent it. He borrowed it from Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher who'd noticed the same pattern 25 centuries earlier. Push anything hard enough toward one extreme, and it flips into its opposite. Here's the assumption this destroys. You think forcing a thought out is control. It isn't. It's the exact mechanism that guarantees the thought's return, amplified. Jung watched this play out clinically, over and over, until he stopped calling it a coincidence and started calling it a law. He wrote that the only person who escapes what he called the grim law of enantiodromia is someone who deals with an unwanted psychic content not by repressing it, for then it simply attacks him from the rear. Read that again. Not by fighting it head-on and winning, by refusing to fight it at all, and instead putting it plainly in front of himself as something separate from who he is. Most people do the opposite. They meet the intrusive thought, the spike of dread, the shame that arrives uninvited, and they go to war with it immediately. Full force, right at the front door. Jung is telling you that's precisely how it gets in through the back. Think about your own version of the American businessman Jung once described in his lectures. A man so committed to one extreme, control, rationality, the relentless optimization of himself, that the very intensity of his commitment was quietly building the pressure for its collapse. You don't need to be that dramatic to feel this. You just need to remember the last time you decided, with real willpower, that you would simply stop thinking about something. And you need to remember exactly how long that lasted. Here's what to actually watch for, starting today. The next time you catch yourself suppressing a thought, really pushing, gritting your teeth against it, time how long it takes to come back. Not vaguely, specifically. If it returns within minutes, louder, more detailed, more insistent than before, you are not witnessing a personal failure of discipline. You are witnessing enantiodromia in real time inside your own skull. That rebound isn't proof that something is wrong with you. It's proof that the law is working exactly as Jung described it, whether you've read a page of him or not. But naming the law isn't enough. Knowing that suppression backfires doesn't tell you where all that redirected energy actually goes when you push a thought down. It doesn't just vanish into nothing, and it doesn't just bounce back randomly either. It goes somewhere specific, into a part of the psyche Jung spent his life mapping, the part that collects everything you've refused to let yourself feel and quietly waits for its turn. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Most people assume the mind has something like a delete key. Press hard enough on a feeling, and it's gone. Jung thought the mind had something closer to a basement, and nothing you send down there disappears. It just changes address and waits for the lights to go out upstairs. This is the part of 2 essays on analytical psychology that reframes everything you just learned about enantiodromia. Jung wasn't only describing a law of reversal, he was describing where the reversed energy actually goes. He called it the shadow, not evil, not pathology, just the disowned half of whatever your conscious mind has decided to stand for. The conscious mind is on top, the shadow underneath, he wrote, and just as high always longs for low and hot for cold, so all consciousness seeks its unconscious opposite, lacking which it is doomed to stagnation, congestion, and ossification. Sit with that phrase for a second. Congestion, not collapse, not disappearance, congestion, pressure with nowhere to go. Here's what this means for the thought you've been trying to kill. Every ounce of energy you spend forcing "I will not feel anxious" doesn't evaporate when the thought goes quiet for a moment. It gets rerouted. And because psychic energy in Jung's model always seeks its compensatory opposite, it tends to resurface exactly where you didn't post a guard, as tension in your jaw you can't explain, as irritability at someone who did nothing wrong, as a wave of dread about something completely unrelated to what you actually suppressed an hour earlier. This is not superstition, it's structural. Jung watched it happen clinically so consistently that he stopped treating it as coincidence and started treating it as mechanism. Whatever you refuse to let move through consciousness directly will move through you indirectly, disguised, and usually at a worse moment than the one you were trying to protect. Here's the practice, and it takes under a minute. The next time you notice an irritation, a tightness, or a free-floating worry that seems to come from nowhere, don't investigate the new feeling first. Ask instead, what did I refuse to feel in the last hour? Not the last week. The last hour. 9 times out of 10, you'll find the actual source sitting exactly where you left it. The phone call you avoided thinking about, the criticism you brushed off too fast, the sadness you converted into busyness the moment it appeared. That's not a coincidence. That's the shadow finding a side door, because you locked the front one. This is also why willpower alone was never going to be the answer here. Willpower is a front door strategy. It can hold a thought at the entrance for a while, sometimes for hours, occasionally for days. But Jung's entire clinical career was built on watching what happens to the energy that gets held back rather than processed. And it does not simply wait patiently for you to feel strong enough. It finds the unguarded exit. So the real problem was never the strength of your discipline. It was the location of your effort. You've been standing at the wrong door, guarding a thought that was never going to leave by the way it came in, while something else, somewhere else in you, quietly absorbs the charge, which raises a harder question than the one you started with. If fighting the thought directly only relocates it, what does it actually mean to stop fighting it at all? That's where Jung's map gets genuinely strange, because the 2 most common responses to a painful thought, believing you are it, or battling to make it disappear, turn out to be the same mistake wearing different clothes. You do this more than you think. Somewhere in the last week, you had a thought, a spike of anxiety, a flash of anger, a wave of shame, and you didn't just experience it. You became it, at least for a few seconds. I am anxious, instead of anxiety is happening. That collapse between you and the content passing through you is so fast and so automatic that most people never even notice it occurred. Jung had a name for what needs to happen instead, and it starts with a distinction most people never make. He wrote that the patient must learn to differentiate what is ego and what is non-ego, meaning the parts of the psyche that are genuinely you and the parts that are simply passing through the territory you happen to occupy. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Fighting a thought and becoming a thought feel like opposites. They aren't. When you identify with a thought, you fuse with it completely, and now you have to eliminate it to feel like yourself again. When you fight a thought, you've technically separated from it, but you're still fused to it through the fight itself, still spending the entirety of your attention on its defeat. Different posture, same trap. In both cases, the thought is running the show, and you are either the hostage or the negotiator, never simply the person in the room who doesn't have to take the call. This is not a semantic distinction. It changes what you actually do the next time dread shows up uninvited. Try this. Specifically, the next time it happens, instead of saying, "I am panicking," say silently to yourself, "Panic is moving through me right now." Not as a trick, as an accurate report. One sentence identifies you with a weather system. The other correctly locates you as the sky it's passing through. Most people resist this at first because it feels like giving up. It isn't. Giving up would be obeying the thought, letting the anxiety cancel the plan, letting the shame dictate the apology, letting the anger write the text message. Witnessing is neither surrender nor combat. It's the one option nobody offered you growing up, because nobody around you had heard of it either. Notice, too, that this isn't about calming the thought down. The anxiety in that experiment doesn't necessarily get quieter the moment you stop fusing with it or fighting it. What changes is your address. You're no longer inside the storm issuing commands it will never obey. You're standing somewhere it can be observed, instead of somewhere it has to be won or lost. This is harder than either of the old options, at least at first, because both identification and combat come with a built-in sense of doing something. Witnessing can feel, in the first attempts, like doing nothing at all. That feeling is misleading. Jung considered this exact shift, this capacity to differentiate ego from psychic content without needing to destroy the content. A marker of real psychological maturity, not a passive stance, but the hardest work the psyche performs, which leaves the actual mechanics unanswered. If you're no longer supposed to fight the thought or dissolve into it, what happens in the space where the fight used to be? Jung had a precise answer for that, and it isn't stillness. It's a conversation. One he insisted needs to happen on genuinely equal terms between two things you've never thought to introduce to each other. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings with equal rights. Jung wrote that in 1916, and it might be the strangest sentence in his entire body of work. He isn't being poetic. He means it as a literal, technical description of what a healthy mind is supposed to do with a conflict it can't resolve by force. Here's the assumption this destroys. You've spent this whole video learning that fighting a thought backfires and that becoming a thought is its own trap. The natural next guess is that the answer must be some kind of neutral distance, polite indifference, a shrug, waiting the feeling out. That guess is wrong, and Jung was specific about why. Indifference isn't dialogue. Dialogue requires two positions that actually speak, back and forth, each one taken seriously enough to answer the other. Jung called the mechanism that makes this possible the transcendent function, and he described its actual mechanics almost mechanically. The shuttling to and fro of arguments and effects represents the transcendent function of opposites. The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy. Notice what he's not saying. He's not saying the conscious position wins. He's not saying the unconscious position, the fear, the shame, the impulse, gets to dictate the outcome either. He's saying something has to happen between them. With both sides granted the same standing you'd give a person you actually respect. Here's what that looks like outside a psychology paper. Take the anxious thought you practiced witnessing in the last part. Instead of stopping at "anxiety is moving through me," go one step further tonight. On paper, actually, literally, write the anxious position's case in one sentence. Then write your calmer position's honest reply. Then let the anxious position answer that reply. 3 or 4 exchanges, no more. You are not debating to win. You are doing, on paper, exactly what Jung described happening internally, shuttling the argument back and forth until something shifts. Most people skip this because it feels absurd to argue with your own dread in writing. It feels absurd because you've never been told this is a documented psychological mechanism and not a coping trick. Jung didn't consider it optional. He considered the transcendent function, in his own words, the most significant factor in psychological process. Not a technique for calm days, but the actual engine of how a mind changes. This is also where willpower and witnessing both run out of road. Witnessing tells you not to fuse with the thought. It doesn't tell you what to do with the two positions once you've separated them, and they're just sitting there, still in conflict, still unresolved. The transcendent function is the part of Jung's model that answers that question directly. You let them talk, genuinely, until neither one is simply repeating itself. Something happens when that exchange actually runs its course, and it isn't compromise, and it isn't one side quietly losing. Jung called it something stranger than either of those outcomes. A third position that didn't exist in either the conscious argument or the unconscious one, born entirely from the friction between them. What that third thing actually is, and how you'll recognize it the moment it shows up, is where we're going next. Something new is not the same as something resolved. That distinction is the whole point of what Jung called the transcendent function, and it's the part most people miss when they try the exercise from the last section. Here's what usually happens. You write the anxious position's case, then the calmer reply, back and forth a few times, expecting the exchange to end in a verdict. Anxiety was right, or anxiety was wrong. Jung said, that's not what you're looking for. He was precise about it. The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living third thing. Not a logical stillbirth in accordance with the principle tertium non datur, but a movement out of the suspension between the opposites, a living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation. Read what he's ruling out, not a compromise, not one side winning while the other concedes. A third thing that didn't exist in either position before they were forced to actually speak. Here's how to recognize it, because it rarely announces itself. It's usually not a solution. It's a sentence that surprises you. One neither your anxious voice nor your reasonable voice had said in the earlier exchanges, arriving almost sideways, often quieter than expected. Go back over your written dialogue and look for it. A line in the third or fourth exchange that doesn't sound like either character you started with. That line is the transcendent function doing its work. This stops being abstract once you take it past private anxiety. Jung believed the same mechanism could soften a marriage fight that's calcified into a script, or a family rift running on the same two accusations for a decade. Because both sides there are usually negotiating for victory instead of waiting for a third thing neither has said yet. So here's the practice, distilled for tonight. The next time you're in a disagreement that's circling, with a partner, a parent, yourself, resist the urge to find the winning argument. Ask instead what a third position would sound like, one that isn't your case and isn't theirs. It often arrives as a single, unexpected sentence. That sentence is worth more than being right. None of this is a one-time repair. Jung didn't treat the transcendent function as a trick performed once and then filed away as solved. He treated it as a mechanism the psyche is meant to keep running for the rest of a life. Every time consciousness and its opposite generate enough tension to need a way through. Which means the real question was never how to fix yourself permanently. It's what it actually looks like to live this way on an ordinary day, with no dramatic conflict in sight, once the war you started this video with has genuinely stopped. There's a version of tonight that used to go a certain way. A thought arrives uninvited, the kind that used to send you straight into the old war. You'd already be reaching for the weapons, suppress it, argue it down, insist to yourself that you don't feel that, you don't think that, not tonight. Here's the difference nobody warns you about. The peace this video has been describing was never going to feel like winning. Winning implies an enemy defeated, a matter closed, a version of you standing over a version of the thought that used to control you. That isn't what happens when enantiodromia stops running the show, when the shadow gets acknowledged instead of exiled, when the dialogue Jung described actually gets held instead of avoided. What happens instead is quieter than victory. The war simply stops being fought because you're no longer standing anywhere it can reach you. Sit with that, because it will disappoint the part of you that wanted vindication. You do not get to declare yourself cured of the thought, the anxiety, the grief, whatever it was. Jung never promised that. If you've been waiting for that particular kind of ending, this isn't it. What you get instead is smaller and stranger. The same thought can resurface next week, next year, and it will simply pass through a mind that no longer treats its presence as an emergency requiring a war to be declared. That's individuation, in Jung's own vocabulary. Not a state you arrive at and then coast inside forever, but a practice renewed every time consciousness and its opposite generate enough tension to need a third way through. There's no graduation day. There's only whether you keep answering when the dialogue asks to be held again. This is also bigger than what happens inside your own head. The same law applies to the argument with your partner that resets every few months without ever actually ending, or the rift with a parent that's run on the same two accusations for a decade. Both sides there are usually convinced somebody has to lose. The transcendent function was never only a private mechanism tucked inside individual therapy. It's the same law, operating at a larger scale, anywhere two positions have been at war long enough that neither one remembers a third was ever possible. So here's what this video is actually leaving you with, and it has nothing to do with willpower. The next time an unwanted thought shows up, tonight, tomorrow, in the middle of a conversation you're already dreading, don't reach for the old weapons. Don't reach for surrender either. Just notice that something in you is speaking and let it finish the sentence. That noticing, small as it looks, is the whole thing. Not a technique you finish today and file away. Just something you now know how to do the next time it's needed. If this video made sense to you, the one appearing on your screen right now will too. Click to keep watching.